Moving the motion to speak will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. À toute la famille de...
To all of our former Prime Minister's family, Mila, Mark, Carolyn, my sincerest condolences.
Very huge honor and very unlikely event in the life of a very passionate non-conservative to serve as a member of the staff team for the Minister of Environment and ultimately over the years to become a friend of Brian Mulroney. I've never said this to the family, but I used to have this recurring dream after I resigned from the office, and there was a certain amount of bad blood from the other Conservatives, never Brian Mulroney, about me leaving over my minister doing this little thing like breaking the law. And the thing about it was, I had this recurring dream that I kept running up to Brian Mulroney to say, I hope you know I love you. It was weird because I didn't know I felt that way when I was having this dream, but I had it over and over again. And then we got to be friends. And we became friends when I felt compelled as executive director of Sierra Club to write articles to say, look at this legacy. Hello. And I was on the jury for who should be the greenest prime minister. And it wasn't close. This was in 2005. It wasn't like there were a lot of prime ministers who had that kind of record. So in thinking about my remarks today, I've decided there's no way I can actually speak to each of the accomplishments of the Mulroney government and of Brian Mulroney quite personally picking up the phone and putting the negotiations to stop the logging of Guayahanas, putting them back into play by calling Bill Vander Zalm and this was hard work and heavy lifting, and it was personal. Where it came from, I can't tell you, but I know it was profound and real and personal on issue after issue. So I've decided the only way I can get through them is to list them. I can hardly editorialize on the accomplishments because they are so many. But let's start with, under the category of under-promising and over-delivering, the multinational effort to deal with acid rain to actually solve the issue, to make every meeting with the President of the United States of America, our single top bilateral issue was an environmental issue. It was acid rain every time. Then it was the ozone layer. We didn't just put in place some ideas. Brian Mulroney quite literally saved all life on Earth when Canada stood up and organized the Montreal Protocol and saved the ozone layer so that it now just is no longer being eroded. It's repairing itself. And I was never so proud as to see him at the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol in Montreal when he even mentioned me in his speech there. We were there in the same Congress where it was negotiated in September 1987. The Montreal Protocol is an astonishing accomplishment for this country, but it was Brian Mulroney personally who delivered it. It was the first international conference on the climate crisis in the last week of June 1988, which former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney opened and gave a speech that brought the House down and brought scientists from all around the world to their feet to cheer for what Stephen Schneider, one of the leading climate scientists, said, my God, this is our Woodstock. Prime ministers also, Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway, opened that conference, the first one. But then the work kept going. The work to acknowledge and support the World Commission on Environment Development and their landmark report, Our Common Future, to lead at the United Nations, to create the Earth Summit for June 1992, to lead with heavy lifting to deliver the Treaty for the Protection of Biological Diversity. And this is one of the hallmarks I was going to mention at the end. The things that Brian Mulroney did, not just standing up to his enemies, that's easy, standing up to his friends. So that when he saved the Biodiversity Convention, and he did quite personally save it when George Bush tried to kill it, He was standing up to his friends. When he stood up to throw South Africa out of the Commonwealth, he had to stand up to his friend whom he loved, Maggie Thatcher, because it was wrong to ignore apartheid and let South Africa be a member of the Commonwealth family. He stood up against his friends, and he stood up to Ronald Reagan on acid rain, and he delivered an agreement between Canada and the U.S. that actually ended the scourge of acid rain pollution in Canada. He banned lead in gasoline. He banned the herbicide that was carcinogenic, Alachlor. He brought in the environmental legislation we still have, and some of which has been tragically repealed. He brought in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. He brought in the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. He brought in Canada's only federal water policy, and he created new institutions, only some of which we still have. He brought in the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. He created the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He created the post of Ambassador for the Environment. He did the early work that led to the creation of the Arctic Council. He brought in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements, multilateral agreements between many levels of governments, provinces, and federally. And he brought in the national parks, one after the other, Katatina Park, which was then we called Ellesmere, creating that on Ellesmere Island. Guayahanas, we talked earlier today in the House of the news of what's been done for the Haida, with the Haida Nation and acknowledging their sovereignty. But for Brian Mulroney to fly to Vancouver Island to sign the deal with Premier Van der Zalm, and I'll never forget Pat Carney, another dear friend we lost this year, saying to all the men gathered there, you know, a lot of what you've done in your political careers will be forgotten, but this will last. This will always be remembered. Guayahanas National Park, Canada's Galapagos, personally saved by Brian Mulroney. Yes, all the Haida elders who blocked the logging roads and got arrested can't take the thing away from their courage. But the personal courage of the elders who blocked the logging road would have come to a historical footnote if Brian Mulroney hadn't been willing to get a deal and get Bill Van der Zalm back to the negotiating table. Grasslands National Park, Pacific Rim National Park, Georgian Bay National Park, the early work on the Rouge Valley. Making poverty history, the best international development funding record Canada has ever had, the closest we've ever come to the Pearson target, was under Brian Mulroney when we still had a Canadian International Development Agency. Our funding commitments under Brian Mulroney were the most generous of Canada's whole history in international development, stepping up to respond to the Ethiopian famine. The problem is with this kind of resume, not only can you not pad it, you can't even list it and not run out of time. How did he do all this? Well, he had skills and talents. Being Irish, I can only suspect he actually physically once kissed the Blarney Stone. There's no real way to explain how he could charm the birds out of the trees, but he sure as heck could. And he could make people laugh. I loved his jokes so much. I feel like that old joke where you could just give the punchlines and the family will know which ones were the best. But, you know, do you know who I am? I'm the man who gives out the butter. These were great jokes. They made the timing, his comic timing was perfect. But one thing about Brian Mulroney's humor, and he was great at it, there was never a joke at anyone's expense. There was never a cruel joke. And if there was ever a joke at someone's expense, it was his own self-deprecating humor at his own expense. Talking about the time back in 2005 when he missed the first award dinner for his being the greenest prime minister. And he talked about it later, about being in hospital, and some old guy who looked pretty rough looking at him and saying, "Did you used to be Brian Mulroney?" But he could make, at your lowest moments, he could make you laugh, and that's another thing that I just can't say enough, how grateful I am and how deeply honored I am, and there's no explaining the generosity and the kindness of his heart, that when I was having low moments now and then, I couldn't believe it when my office would say, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney wants to talk to you on the phone. Are you kidding me? I'd love to tell you what he said, but it's so darn funny, but I really can't repeat it. Dear Brian Mulroney, there aren't any pearly gates anywhere near this place. Like a bat out of hell, one would say, but still, I know where there's a proper welcome and open arms and angelic choirs for someone who deserved and deserves to come home. God bless you and your family and your children and your grandchildren and all who loved you. You lived well and you loved this country. Let us continue to try to meet that example of a good-hearted, kind, spirited, generous, and brilliant Canadian.
Hear, hear.